Thanks very much for doing this interview, and I know this has been an extremely busy time for you last 3-4 months. I mean, I was lucky enough to have been free that day to be able to attend, Polly's funeral, but it must have been quite a tumultuous, but also quite an inspiring time over the last 3-4 months.
It's been quite extraordinary, actually. When Polly first became ill, Polly Higgins, as I'm sure you know, she was keen for people to know what was happening. And we had an extraordinary response of sort of pouring in of love and support, but also shock and devastation, as well as a large number of people saying, my gosh, what are we going to do without Polly? How are we going to, how is the work towards making ecocide a crime internationally, which is what Polly had dedicated her last 10 years of her life to? How is this going to move forward without Polly? And then what actually happened when Polly departed, and she passed away on Easter Day, and since then there's been this extraordinary thing where actually large numbers of people have really stepped up and got in touch and said, we want to help make this happen, not wanting this incredibly vital work to die with her. And, obviously for me, I've suddenly found myself at the coordination point of two key sides of the work. So obviously the legal, strategic, sort of diplomatic work, which is the core work on the international level. And we have a team now of 7 or 8 lawyers, researchers, diplomats working on that with us. But also a campaign team based locally here in the UK, which has grown hugely since Polly left us. We now have a core team of 12, we have over 50 volunteers, we have now over 10,000 signed up earth protectors to our campaign, which has been rebranded this year, and it's now known as Stop Ecocide, Change the Law, which is much more of a does what it says on the tin kind of name. So that's what's been happening, and I found myself at the sort of coordination point at the centre of that, and it's been quite a whirlwind.
When did you co-found Mission Life Force with Polly? When was that? How long ago was that?
That was at the end of 2017. Polly had been working really since 2010 on the whole concept of ecocide as a crime and bringing that into international law and promoting that as a concept. And if you've heard the word ecocide or can work out what it means, that's probably largely due to her awareness-raising work over that decade. A realisation that she came to back in 2016 was that wealthy states were not going to be throwing their weight behind this, for obvious reasons. They've got very close links with the big transnational polluting companies and economic links. But also the big NGOs were not keen. They saw it as very high risk, as quite controversial. Head of one of the big environmental NGOs even said to Polly, this is too big for us, we can't deal with this. And I think her internal response was, I'll go back to my bedroom and carry on then. Yeah. But what she realised was that if we were going to get funding for this, it was going to have to be crowdfunded, because actually she had a very enthusiastic following worldwide. We essentially put our heads together. Polly is the legal brain, and myself, I came from a campaigning background. Yeah. Started off with anti-fracking, anti-incineration work, and that's how we ended up working together, doing research around fracking. And so it was a kind of combination, if you like, of the legal side and the campaigning side, and creating a public-facing campaign to actually support promoting ecocide law. Yeah, so we realised that actually creating a public-facing campaign would enable us to do something that corporations normally do, which is to say lobby for and often fund, to a certain extent, laws that are brought in by our governments, because they have the connections, they have the clout with the politicians, they take the right people to dinner, you could say. And so this was an opportunity to take forward a law, but based on crowdfunding, based on the people funding a law that we want. And it's a protective law, it's to protect the earth.
And this would probably be a good moment to define, if you don't mind, what ecocide is, just for people who are beginning just to be able to kind of catch on, or this is still relatively new to.
Yeah.
So ecocide.
So for those of you who are not aware of ecocide as a concept or potentially a legal development, Polly submitted a definition of ecocide into the UN Law Commission back in 2010 and defined it as serious loss, damage to or destruction of ecosystems to the extent that the peaceful enjoyment of the inhabitants has been or will be severely diminished. In other words, put in layman's terms, it's the large-scale destruction of the natural living world. And the idea is to add this as a crime alongside war crimes, genocide and crimes of humanity at the International Criminal Court, so that it becomes a crime at an international level.
So why isn't it? Why? What happened? Something must have happened. It was introduced and then removed, or?
Well, it's interesting because when Polly started to research it, what she discovered was that when the Rome Statute, which is the governing document for the International Criminal Court, and therefore the highest legal document in the world in a way, because it governs international criminal law. When it was drafted, ecocide was originally part of the drafting, and this was found out by Polly, and almost by accident, where some researchers were investigating a whole bunch of documents in a basement of the UN and discovered these documents which showed that in fact it had been in there, but it didn't make the final cut, and it was dropped at the last hurdle, if you like, under the influence of several powerful states, including the UK, the Netherlands and France, all of which, of course, are oil states. And so it never made the final version.
Which is sort of a crime in itself, isn't it?
Exactly. So what Polly realised was actually that we were looking at not just a crime that is missing in terms of we can see all this destructive activity happening in our environment, and there isn't a crime that covers it, but it's literally missing in the sense that it was previously intended to be there and had been removed. So in a sense, her mission at that point became reinstating the missing crime, in the meantime, there has been one addition to the Rome Statute, which is crimes of aggression, that was properly ratified in 2017, fairly recently. So there are now 4 crimes on that statute, which means that we know that an amendment is possible and can be done and has been done before. We also know that ecocide was originally intended to be in there. So we're not talking a completely new concept here. Although for many people the idea of ecocide, they have to kind of make that link between genocide as the mass destruction of people, if you like, and ecocide being the mass destruction of the natural world. So yeah.
The UK recently responded to the UK government. Sorry, I should say recently responded to the ecocide proposal, and I think you've responded. I'm just wondering whether you could encapsulate.
Yes, indeed. We realised one of the things we did when we rebranded, when we refreshed the campaign, which happened earlier this year at the same time as the Rebellion Week in April, where the Extinction Rebellion had this massive uprising in London, and also kind of joined forces, if you like, with the climate strikers across the world inspired by Greta Thunberg, so the youth strikes and so on. And what we've seen is this massive sort of uprising of awareness, more than anything, of people realising the extent of the emergency that we're in terms of climate and ecology. And one of the things we realised was that while our key work is actually taking it forward at the International Criminal Court, and I'll explain in a minute why that is, nevertheless, people requesting a crime of ecocide to be added to their domestic legislation is still a very powerful thing to show that there is civil support for this. And so we started a petition on the government website using the government software saying make ecocide a UK criminal offence. And that passed the sort of requisite first 10,000 signatures a while back, and the government had to respond to it, which they did in a sadly inadequate manner, it has to be said, where they said, we have plenty of environmental regulations already in force, and some of those are criminal offences if they're breached, and we don't actually recognise ecocide as a crime, and we would not intend to criminalise it. Obviously, it's a little disingenuous given that we know that the UK was one of those countries which prevented ecocide from reaching the Rome Statute back in the late 90s. So it's certainly not the case that they don't understand what it is. One can only assume that when they say we don't recognise ecocide, that means that, legally speaking, we don't recognise it and have no intention to do so. Obviously, we fully expect that to change over time. One of the things that is really important to note here is the difference between civil and criminal law, because actually a lot of environmental regulation sits in the civil law sphere. And it's often very detailed. It's often about exactly what you can and can't do in certain situations. And it's hopelessly enforced. In this country, I mean, for example, the Environment Agency, which is one of the agencies that's supposed to enforce environmental regulations, is woefully underfunded and increasingly underfunded, and has great difficulty enforcing what there is, let alone dealing with the large-scale level of destruction that we're looking at across boundaries. And I think also this speaks to a kind of fundamental misunderstanding, well, not misunderstanding exactly, but a kind of perceptual problem that we have in our culture that is not shared by Indigenous cultures who truly understand the deep links between us and the earth. You know, they understand that a thriving earth means a thriving humanity, you know, that actually the two are intimately linked.
Yeah.
And of course, well, you know, climate science and ecological science is telling us that this is the case anyway. I mean, you know, we're looking at, you know, wildly depleted topsoils, polluted rivers, deforestation, all of these things that very, very directly affect, you know, our ability to survive on this planet. And yet, in the first world, we still have this incredible sense of separation. And that's quite easily illustrated if you look at, I mean, let's say you're going to start a business. You wouldn't sit down with your prospective partners and talk about how do we carry on our business without killing anybody. And the reason you don't have that conversation is because the assumption is so profoundly ingrained that, of course, that's not what you do with a business.
Yeah.
I mean, if you do that, then you're not called a business, you're called like the mafia or something. You know, that it's not even discussed. And yet with the environment, we don't do this. You know, we go to the government for permits, whether it's for fracking or for oil extraction or for, you know, for various, you know, what we would term ecocidal activities. Because it's not automatically assumed that actually what we're talking about here is a high level of abuse.
Yeah.
You know, in the same way, you know, I mean, you wouldn't go to the government and sort of say, you know, can I have a permit for my new venture? You know, it's going to beat a whole bunch of people up and probably kill a few hundred, but, you know, it'll be great for jobs. I mean, you just don't do that. Yeah. So that just gives you an idea of the disconnect.
So the problem is that it's not self-evident.
Yeah, and it should be. Yeah. And it should be. Yeah. And criminal law is really where that comes into play, because criminal law is about morality, and it's about protection. So again, with a very simple example, you know, we all have the right to life. It's, if you like, it's the basic human right, is the right to life. And yet, unless we have a criminal law that corresponds to that creates a responsibility around that, and that law is the law of murder. You know, if you don't have a law of murder, and murder isn't a crime, then how is your right to life protected? Yeah. You know, it's protective law. So it's a way of conceiving of criminal law as for what it actually does, which is it protects. And civil law can't do that. And for that reason, you know, climate litigation, all these cases of suing companies for environmental negligence or damage or climate emergency and so on, you know, they're all really kind of mopping the floor with the tap running. Because unless that harm is prevented at source, unless those activities are actually made illegal, then the funding continues to flow in that direction.
I was just thinking, a very good case, last 24 hours, I think something that was put up on your Twitter feed or Facebook. It's the case in Amulsa in Armenia, where there's this gold mine, which the company is based, I think, in Jersey, and they went in and, you know, caused havoc. The local population have actually responded.
They were out in force this week.
Right.
Yeah.
And managed to kind of initially stop it, but now it looks like it could now go back to. But the company's now sort of taking this to court, isn't it? So if Ecocide was in place, in a way, that would protect them. But there would be somewhere for them to go to, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. And also, I mean, I think the key thing to realise here as well is that because we're looking at such a fundamental change in business attitudes. I mean, at the moment, you know, it's very. In fact, ecocide is a very different kind of crime to, say, war crimes. I mean, you know, with war crimes, you're going to go to war with somebody. You kind of have to intend to do it. Yeah. With ecocide, it's not on the whole a state crime, although many of the big polluters are state-sponsored or state-owned. It's generally a crime of corporations. And it's a crime of recklessness, if you like, rather than intent. I mean, the head of that mining company is unlikely to be sitting there kind of stroking his cat and rubbing his hands and sort of cackling, saying, I'm going to go and destroy the environment. He's basically looking at how we make the most money, and how do we make a return, how do we return to our shareholders, because that is what our business obligation is. And so in effect, what a law of ecocide would do is create a different bottom line, which effectively puts environmental destruction on a par with killing people, effectively, so that it actually changes that whole arena. And that is something that, if we're going to make a change of that scale, it is a question of how we do that. And this is probably a good point to describe the process at the International Criminal Court for doing this, which actually is very straightforward and, for a number of reasons, the most appropriate way to go. So the International Criminal Court has at the moment 122 member states. Varies a little year on year. Sometimes people withdraw, sometimes people join, and we believe more people will be joining. But only one head of state is required to table an amendment. And once that amendment is on the table, there isn't a veto. It's a question of ratification process by states. And once you reach 2/3 of the member states that have ratified it, that law can be enforced internationally. If you get 7/8 of the states, it actually applies to every member. But even at 2/3, those who've ratified it, it becomes enforceable. So it's actually a relatively straightforward process, much more so, in fact, than bringing in a new law in domestic legislation. And of course, once the amendment has been ratified, those who ratify it then need to incorporate it into their domestic legislation, rather as an EU directive is incorporated into domestic legislation for EU members. And so it's by far the most straightforward way to go about this. But the key thing about it is, for us, the real turning point, if you like, is going to be when a state actually steps forward to propose that amendment. Because at that point, you actually see, we're going to see a big shift in people's perception. Because at that point, we get to point to that and go, this country has had the courage to stand up and say that this is what's necessary, and they've actually put their weight behind it. What's your excuse? Now, in our current climate, to coin a phrase, the only real reason that a government would have not to support something like this is, we would say, lack of imagination and short-term economic gain. Now, given that we're looking potentially the extinction of many species, including our own, in the face, lack of imagination would seem to be a bit of a criminal offence in itself. And it would certainly give civil society a huge lever at that point. So our key aim is to get to that point. And we are already partway down the road to doing this. This is not just a great idea. When Polly Higgins, who has been, as we've said, was working on that for a decade. You notice how I say has been, because it's been so recent that she's still here in my mind, It's extraordinary. I mean, it really does. I mean, often, in fact, given how the campaign's expanding, it really does feel like she's kind of working with us. It's incredible. But I've now lost my thread.
Oh, can I throw Vanuatu into the
absolutely. That's right. This is where I was going to. This is where I was going to come to. Yeah. So as Polly realised, the big wealthy states were not going to be playing ball on this one, but there are small climate vulnerable states. Who are already feeling the sharp end of climate change, who are already suffering from, extra severe weather events, from rises in sea levels. Some of them, these islands are only a metre above sea level themselves. So we're looking at an existential threat, and they've now acknowledged it. In fact, the Pacific Islands have acknowledged this as being the most serious existential threat. To them. And so for them, climate ecocide in particular is absolutely topical, present, happening now. And they have the biggest incentive to take forward a law of this kind. And we've been working, our legal international team has been working with these islands now for 3 years. And in particular, one of the leading islands, Vanuatu, is in an ongoing working relationship with us. That's very positive, and they're seriously considering adopting this as one of their possible routes to dealing with climate climate emergency, they've already publicly stated that they're prepared to sue fossil fuel companies, and we're now talking with them about the possibility of following up the criminal aspect as well.
So you're going after the corporations as opposed to the nation states mostly, aren't you?
Well, the way that criminal
or is it, yes.
the way that criminal law works, it's actually individuals that
Right.
you're looking at.
Right.
That can be state or it can be corporate.
Yeah.
So, for example, in a rather bold move last December, we launched what is known in the ICC as a preliminary investigation, not through the ICC but independently, if you like, as a kind of experiment to look at, were Ecocide in place, could we prosecute these particular people for climate ecocide, and name the CEOs of Shell as possible examples.
Yeah.
You see, the thing with criminal law is it's personal responsibility, and one of the problems with civil law and with suing companies is that you can end up mired in a kind of head-to-head battle that can last for years, can cost you millions. You have to somehow your community or is going to have to source that funding. And you're dealing with companies with huge, bottomless sometimes pockets, and very, very highly qualified lawyers, and lots of them, and
Who can just keep on kicking the can.
Just keep on kicking the can, exactly. Yeah. And as you go down that road, you may, if you're lucky, you may end up with some compensation. But in a weird kind of way, it's almost like that's endorsing their activity, because you're kind of saying, well, you can do this as long as you pay us afterwards. Yeah. I mean, would you say this to, I don't know, let's say someone's beating up their wife, would you say, well, you can carry on punching us so long as you give us some money afterwards? No, you say, stop, this is a crime, you're personally responsible. And what a criminal law of ecocide would do is it goes to the top level. So it goes to the CEOs, to the heads of operations, to the people that are ultimately responsible, in the same way as the other atrocity crimes. With war crimes, with genocide, you're not prosecuting individual soldiers, you're prosecuting, the general, the head of state, that actually ordered that atrocity to happen.
Yeah.
And so people often ask, oh my gosh, well, aren't we all going to be guilty of ecocide? We're all driving fossil fuel cars, and the answer to that is, well, no, it goes to the top level. Plus, I mean, there's the interesting thing. I mean, one acquaintance of ours has recently said that she considered that the greatest coup of corporate PR in the last 30 years is making everyone feel individually guilty and responsible for what is happening to the planet. Don't get me wrong, of course we all need to look at our carbon footprints, of course we all need to do whatever we can, but I can speak from personal experience. The reason I drive a fossil fuel car, and a very cheap, rather falling apart one at that, is because I cannot afford anything else, and that is not my choice. That is a choice of policy, of subsidies, and that's a choice that goes on at the top level between big business and government. So what is offered to consumers and what is sold to consumers via the advertising and PR industry is actually what has brought us to this point where that same industry can now say to us, oh, well, it's all your fault because you keep buying these things. That there's a distinct difference to make there, I think, between who's responsible for what. And, Ecocide goes to the heart of that.